All right, it's a few minutes after 7, so Dan, if you're ready, we can get going, okay?
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Um, Thanks there. Uh, my name is Dan Benson. I work for Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and I'm an agriculture water specialist based out of Peace River. And I've been invited tonight to talk about dugout management, so different things like quality and supply. So what I have for you tonight, all right, my slide here. I have three presentations I'm going to do. The first is on dugout construction and different things related to that. The next one is on dugout water quality. And finally, I'll talk just briefly about the Canada Agriculture Partnership, in particular the water program, and how dugouts fit into that. Okay, so dugout construction. I'm going to cover proper siting of dugouts, some regulations that can impact dugouts, sizing, and how that impacts dugouts, design considerations you might want to consider, and also some information on operating systems for dugouts. So with dugouts, they are an important water source for farms and also a common water source for cattle on summer pastures. So often pastures don't have other water sources, so dugouts are commonly placed in a pasture situation. Dugouts are also important where groundwater is unavailable, so much of the northern piece does not have groundwater, mostly just due to geological conditions. The groundwater is just not available, and if it is available, it's of very poor quality. There are a few exceptions around Grimshaw and different shallow aquifers, but generally not a lot of groundwater in the northern Peace region. So if you are thinking of constructing a dugout, you should be aware that there are regulations you have to look at and address. First of all, dugouts must meet federal, provincial, and municipal requirements. In Alberta, water is owned by the Crown. So that means the province of Alberta owns the water, and the right to use the water is given from the Crown. So it's not actually owned by the landowner. In Alberta, the Water Act is what covers water in the province, and that is administered by Alberta Environment and Parks, or AEP for short. Generally for municipal requirements, it's more to do with boundaries, like how far it is from a property line or how far from a highway or a road. Regulations and the Water Act, how they apply. So the AEP Water Act is a legislation that applies to dugout construction. So you may or may not need an approval to construct the dugout from AEP. It depends on these four factors generally. So approvals are required before the start of construction. Just remember that it can't be after. You have to apply, you have to consider before. The first is if it is located in a water body or wetland. The next one is it would change the flow of water on an adjacent parcel of land. If your dugout has a capacity, will have a capacity of greater than 2,500 cubic meters, or 550,000 imperial gallons, or the last one is located in the same watercourse and parcel of land as an existing dugout. So if any one of these four apply to the dugout, you will need to get an approval from Alberta Environment and Parks prior to construction. So the way you go about getting an approval now is through the Digital Regulatory Assurance System, or DRAS for short. And this became effective in November in 2021. So all new surface water, groundwater application amendments, amalgamation transfers, renewals for Water Act license must be submitted through the Digital Regulatory Assurance System. So this system is an online application. So you go online to fill out and to start the process. And just be aware, it does take a while. It's not something you can plan on constructing a dugout the next week or something. It is a bit, there is a bit of a time that's required to go through the process. So it is a one-stop application, but the timeline is the issue you have to address. I talked earlier about if your dugout is potentially in a wetland could cause issues. So if you're not sure of the dugout location, whether it would be considered a wetland or not, that may be an issue as far as placing the dugout. What happens with wetlands is they fall under the wetland policy. So I'll just read what the goal of the wetland policy it is. The goal of the wetland policy is to conserve, restore, protect, and manage Alberta's wetlands to sustain the benefits they provide to the environment, society, and economy. So if you're not sure where you're putting your dugout is, if it is considered a wetland, you need to contact AEP to find out whether or not you require an assessment. If an assessment is required, they will come out, or you'll have to hire a professional to come out. Usually it's a biologist or some other type similar location. And they'll come out and they'll look at the site and they'll determine the boundaries. Well, first of all, they'll determine if it is a wetland, what classification of wetland it is, and the actual boundaries. So if it is a wetland, wetland loss requires replacement costs be paid. So if you are impacting a wetland or destroying a wetland, you will have to pay the replacement cost. The replacement cost is based on the wetland classification. So there's 4 different classifications of wetlands. So based on that classification, the size of the wetland and the location of the province will impact what you have to pay so much a hectare or acre to replace that wetland. Generally, I advise to follow this triangle, part of the wetland policy. You want to avoid wetlands. If you are impacting, make it minimize your impact. And the worst thing you'll have to do is replace. So you don't want to have to pay that replacement cost if you can help it. So try to avoid wetlands when placing dugouts. So when you are thinking of siting a dugout, there's 4 pictures here you might want to consider when you're looking at the process. So the 2 on the left are what is recommended. So the top one is the dugout is filled entirely with runoff from the surrounding land. So where you place the dugout, water will flow in from the surrounding lands and fill up the dugout. So that's a recommended location. The next one below that is the dugout is constructed near a water course, and the flow is directed into the dugout. So again, that's recommended. That's an excellent way to fill a dugout and how to place a dugout. What we don't recommend is when the dugout is constructed in a water course. So the problem with putting the dugout in a water course is there's no way to control that water, and you will have siltation after a while and you will lose that capacity. Plus you have no capacity to control what water goes into your dugout. The bottom one on the right is a groundwater fed dugout. Probably not common in the Peace region to have groundwater fed dugouts, more common on the eastern slopes. But it's basically when a dugout is dug, it will encounter the water table. and that water table will fill the dugout to the same level as the water table. So you might think this is a good idea. You got groundwater flowing into your dugout, but the problem is when you have drought years, the water table will drop and any water in your dugout will disappear into the groundwater and into that water table. The problem with that is you can contaminate groundwater because there will be a certain amount of surface water flowing into your dugout, and it can be a contamination issue. So generally, I don't advise groundwater dugouts. If you are thinking of doing a groundwater dugout, it's better to drill a well, perhaps a large diameter well. Next, regarding siting the dugouts, you'll want to make sure you locate the dugout where they will fill. That is, that there will be sufficient runoff to fill that dugout. It's important that dugouts are located away from sources of contamination. So you don't want to place it where you can potentially get a lot of manure flowing into your dugout, fuel storage, fertilizer storage, different things like that. You want to have your dugouts will be not potentially contaminated from those sources. Remember that a good location is usually more economical in the long run than a convenient location. So what I mean by that is you want your dugout in a location where you're going to have good quality water and you don't have to worry about contamination. If you place it where it's convenient, you may not be able to keep away from those sources, and it will cost you more in the long run to treat the dugout. So when you're sizing the dugout, the first thing we need to know is you need to determine your water demand. So what I mean by water demand is how much water you need or you're going to use out of that dugout every year. So there's a lot of different numbers out there you can use. We have a fact sheet that you can work through that and determine how much water you need. It also depends on whether it's just a summer source or you're going to use the dugout year round. One thing you should, or usually what we look at is when you size a dugout, it should account for those dry years. Say like if you don't get a lot of snowpack, you want to account for those drought years. Generally, the rule of thumb is a 2-year supply. So that's kind of what we recommend, and that should cover most years up here. If you have a drought year 1 year, and you should have snow the next, hopefully. We do have a publication, Alberta Agriculture, Rural and Economic Development publication, Quality Farm Dugouts, and it has a sizing worksheet that you can work through if you want. These 3 maps are part of that sizing worksheet. I'll just kind of go over quickly what they are. The first one is the runoff map on the left. And it's basically just showing most of the Peace region that anywhere from 25 to 50 acres is required for your standard kind of average size dugout, 440,000 gallons. So that's how much acreage, how much watershed is required to fill that dugout. As you move further south, the acreage required gets higher and higher. As you get into the Palliser Triangle, it can be over from anywhere 1,000 to 2,000 acres. So it just demonstrates that there's more stability in the snowpack and as you go further north. So there's more dependable water source. The next diagram or the map to the right is just for ice thickness. So if you are using your dugout in winter, you have to take into account ice thickness if you are planning your dugout for a 2-year supply. Basically, that ice thickness, that supply is not available to you. That, however, thickness of the ice, that's not available as a water source. What it's showing there is basically as you move further north, you're going to have more ice loss. And as you move further south, it's not quite as big of a deal. And then finally, the top one shows evaporation. And again, as you move further south, you're going to have more evaporation. So when you're planning or sizing a dugout, you have to account for that. You want to make sure your dugout is appropriately sized then. So it has the appropriate volume to account for those 2 years. Another thing you should be aware of is that deeper dugouts do save water. So if you go deeper, you will have more water storage. It's important that the slopes that are constructed so they are stable. So generally with a track hole construction, slopes are either 1.5 to 1 or perhaps 2 to 1. And what I mean by that is the run over the rise. So 1.5 would be 1.5 on the horizontal and 1 going down. So that is a stable slope. If you're like the picture on the top there shows a 1.5 to 1 slope, the picture on the right bottom there shows a 0 to 1 slope, so straight up and down. And those will fail. They will cave in. You will lose that capacity that you paid for. They'll fall back in the dugout. So you want to make sure you have 1.5 to 1 slopes. If you are building with like a dozer or a scraper, the slopes are usually 4 to 1 on the end and 1.5 or 2 to 1 on the sides. Another thing is you could consider when designing your dugout is to have a long, narrow dugout. The advantage of that is if you do need to clean out your dugout, it's easier for a track hoe to come in and clean out a dugout that is narrow versus a wide dugout. When you do remove the material out of the dugout, so the spoil piles, they need to be level and seeded to grass. So ideally level them and seed them to grass so that material is not washing back into the dugout. And they should not be placed directly on the side of the dugout, at least 15 feet back. If they are too close to the side of the dugout, they will add extra weight and cause the banks to slough in. Another design characteristic, another design feature you may want to consider is a maintained grass waterway. So if you are draining quite a large area, there can be a significantly amount of water that goes in through that area, so it can flow through there. So you may want to consider a grass waterway. What that is just seeding an area down to permanent cover, and that prevents the soil from erosion when you have runoff events. If you do have grassed waterways, you can still use that land for hay, and it still maintains and will last a lot longer. You may want to consider installing control gates and berms. So I talked earlier about moving water into the dugout from the side. This is one option you can do with control gates and berms. They don't have to be complicated like the picture on the middle there. It can be just as simple as a bale and a piece of plywood, so you can just control the water that goes into your dugout. Generally, your best quality water is your early snow runoff, and once your dugout is full, you shouldn't allow any further runoff to go into the dugout throughout the season. As long as your dugout is adequately sized, once it's full, you should be good for the season. You definitely don't want spring or summer runoff to go into your dugout. If it is a livestock dugout, you want to limit access, and so you want to provide an off-source watering system for the livestock to access. This is important. I'll talk more about that in the next presentation, but water quality issues, your herd health, and just making your dugout last longer. You don't have that action of pushing soil back into the dugout will help in the long run. And you may consider fencing your dugout just to keep the livestock out. So I know a lot of people are, if it is a remote dugout, you may be reluctant to fence a dugout. If you have an off-source watering system, if it goes down, they wouldn't have access. So there are different options. You can maybe leave one side open, but generally livestock will prefer to drink out of an off-source watering system than wade into a dugout. There are some situations where you'll need to seal the dugout so it's not going to hold water, and you have to do something about it. If you're not familiar with your land, what type of subsoil you have, we generally recommend that you do some soil tests, like get a track hoe out there and dig down a few places and check to make sure you have good clay. If you don't have good clay, if you have some sand or gravel or something very porous like that, you may have to seal it. And one method is clay lining. So if you do have some good clay on the top, you can over excavate the dugout by 2 to 3 feet and then repack in that clay, and your dugout should be sealed and hold water. Another method is plastic geotextile liner. So they do work well. The problem with them is that they are very expensive, and you have to make sure you have someone with experience installing them, because if you have any issues at all, it will leak and you'll have just wasted all your money on that. So you need someone with experience to install those. The next one there is bentonite. So what bentonite is, it's a clay material, and when exposed to water, it expands and doesn't allow water to go through. Bentonite will work. It's just getting hold up, finding enough of it so you can seal a dugout. You can mix it in the material and it will work, but just physically getting it may be difficult for you. Next one is glyzation. So what glyzation is, sort of an old method of sealing dugouts. It's basically adding straw, either wheat, oats, or barley straw, and then putting a bit of clay on top. And as that decays, it kind of forms a zone that is difficult for water to get through. It does work, but it has to be repeated. It's not like a permanent solution. Next one is sodium carbonate or soil cement. So you can add sodium carbonate as long as you have at least 20% clay in there. So you can mix that in and then it reacts and seals it off. And finally, perimeter trench or cutoff trench. If you just have a very small sand lens or something like that, you can cut it off and fill it with clay and use that to help seal your dugout. Other design considerations. So you may want to consider 2 dugouts. You often see this in old farmyards. You'll see an older dugout and then a newer dugout. The advantage of having 2 dugouts is that it allows for in situ treatment, which means in place. So you can treat the water in one dugout while you still have access to the other water. It does work well if you have to drain a dugout for some reason or clean a dugout. So you always have a backup source. Dugout operating systems. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's recommended for operating systems. So generally with new dugouts, this picture comes from Quality Farm Dugouts, that manual I talked about. And we recommend having a floating intake. So floating intake is weighted down, but it's on a float. And we generally like to have you take the water from around 3 feet below the surface. So that's generally your best quality water. The other advantage of a floating intake is you can pull it off to the side and if you have to work at it at some point. Floating intakes should be attached to a wet well if you want to use a submersible pump. So the wet well will house the pumping equipment and it'll be attached to a pitless adapter which will move the water to where you need it. Wet wells are usually around 15 feet or so away from the dugout, and the water will rise to the same level as the dugout. You should also add aeration if you are building a new dugout. It's best to install it at the time of construction so you can get it below frost line. What we don't recommend for operating systems are bottom intakes. In the past, quite often people had bottom intakes. The problem with taking water off the bottom of the dugout is that is where you have your poorest water quality. There's very little oxygen at the bottom of the dugout, and you'll have hydrogen sulfide gases. The same goes for if you have a gravel infiltration trench. So instead of that line running from the floating intake over to the wet well, in the past, sometimes they dug a trench and filled it with gravel. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but unfortunately there's no way to clean them out. They get silted in and they have extremely poor water quality associated with them. So if you do have a bottom intake or a gravel infiltration trench, I would recommend getting rid of those and putting in a floating intake. Some of the impacts of poor siting. So if you do put your dugout in a poor location, the issues you're going to have is excess nutrient loading. So manure, different things like that, going to cause a lot of nutrients in your dugout. If your dugout is in a poor location with no natural wind, you won't have any natural aeration. Natural aeration will help your dugout. And plus you don't want that materials coming in off the trees into the dugout. You don't want contamination from the yard site, of course, and it will be a higher cost to treat your dugouts. So if you have these issues, you'll have to spend more money on treating your dugout. And it will also shorten the lifespan of the dugout. So dugouts are expensive, so you want them to last as long as possible. And here I just have some links for you. You can check out at your convenience, Quality Farm Dugouts, Alberta Environment and Parks, Alberta Wetland Policy, and the Digital Regulatory Assurance System. So I think this presentation is recorded, so you can probably access them at a later time. Any questions on this part before I move to the next one?
If anyone has any questions, but they don't want to unmute themselves, you can also send them in a chat to me and I will read them out.
Okay, I guess no questions. So we can, if you think of something, you can ask me towards the end of the presentation as well here. So we'll move on. I'm just going to grab a little drink of water here. Okay, so this one is on dugout water quality. And I'm going to talk about water quality problems, nutrients, how they impact your water quality, talk about aeration, and some types of treatment you can do on in your dugout itself. So good management is the key to good water quality. So it's important to look after your dugout. You want to inspect it regularly, go out there and look at it, look for issues. And if you can spot those issues early, it's generally easier to deal with and treat. Magic bullets generally don't exist. So what I mean by that is there's a lot of different things sold out there that are supposed to improve water quality. The problem is that most of them don't generally work, and they don't take the place of good management. So when you construct a dugout, nutrients enter the dugout from the runoff off the landscape. So in the springtime, when the snow melts and the water runs over the landscape, it picks up nutrients and they flow into the dugout. So over time, these nutrients build up. And you can see the picture there, that's an older dugout. So after 20 years, they lose a lot of capacity. There's sediment and decaying plant material at the bottom of the dugout. So over that time, your dugout water quality will deteriorate as the dugout ages. So your first 5 years, you probably have fairly good water quality. Your next 5 years, you probably see some deterioration in your water quality. And then after that, you may have some serious issues that you have to deal with. One thing about dugouts is they are very similar to other water bodies, and they have plants and animals just like other water bodies. You'll find a wide variety of plants and also animals. They have nutrient recycling, so when animals die or plants die, those nutrients are recycled over and over. So when plants die, they fall to the bottom of the dugout, and these decomposing plants consume oxygen. And when there is a lack of oxygen, it allows anaerobic bacteria to flourish. Anaerobic bacteria produces byproducts like hydrogen sulfide. So that's where you get that H2S smell or rotten egg smell. It can be particularly bad in winter if you don't aerate a dugout. So the bottom of the dugout has a very low oxygen environment. What can you do about that? You want to limit the nutrients going into your dugout. You want to exclude poor water quality. Ideally, you don't want summer rains to flow into the dugout. You just want the snow melt to go into the dugout. Summer rains have a much higher nutrient load than snow melt, so you want to keep those out of your dugout. You can do this by berming your dugout, and as I said, it can be as simple as a piece of plywood or some bales. So you just want to keep that summer rains out of your dugout. Another thing you can consider is vegetative filter strips, so that will help keep a certain amount of nutrients out. You should maintain a riparian area around your dugout, so ideally don't cultivate directly up to the dugout because you can get a lot of erosion going into the dugout. And you'll want to exclude vegetation, so keep the leaves and grass out of the dugout. Keep your deciduous trees back about 150 feet and conifers back 50 feet. You want to lessen the impact, so if it is a livestock dugout, you want to restrict the direct access by providing an off-source watering system. So try to keep the cattle out of the dugout. They're not going to have that shearing action of pushing soil into the dugout, and they're not going to have manure and urine go into the dugout. So manure and urine has high nutrient loads and will cause your water quality to go down very quickly. And also practice grazing management. So maybe there's different things you can do to lessen the impact. Some of the solutions, we can remove the nutrients. So high nutrients levels are the major cause of poor water quality. So nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium, all those are major causes of poor water quality. As you can see in the picture on the top there, he's got some serious issues and he's trying to move out some of the weeds and algae. So higher nutrient levels cause algae and cyanobacteria blooms. So when I talk about cyanobacteria, I'm talking about often called, it's cyanobacteria, but sometimes referred to as blue-green algae. So nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus are tied up in the vegetative matter. So if you can remove those out of your dugout, you're harvesting nutrients out of the dugout. And removing vegetation matter effectively removes nutrients. So weeds, algae, cyanobacteria all need nutrients to grow. So if you can remove those nutrients, you will have better water quality in the long run. I'll just go back. That one on the bottom is duckweed. Duckweed is fairly common in dugouts and freshwater bodies. It's often confused for algae, but it has two leaves and little roots on the bottom. So you ever notice that in your dugout? So one thing you can do is actually remove the weeds. You can cut them and rake them out. So the picture on the bottom just shows a weed cutter. It basically works by just throwing it into the dugout, and when you pull it back, the arms come out, and the arms have blades on them, and it'll cut the weeds off down at the bottom of the dugout. Then the weeds will float to the surface and you can rake them out. So that's one option to remove weeds. The next one on the top is just showing the removal of duckweed. So duckweed floats on the surface. So if it's a windy day, it can blow up to one side of the dugout and you can rake it out. Or in that situation, they're pushing it over and then raking it out. So by removing the duckweed, you're removing nutrients, and removing nutrients will lessen your cyanobacteria in particular. One thing to consider is removal of the above water portion of cattails once the dugout is frozen. So if it's safe to go on the dugout, you can go on it and cut off the top of the cattails, take them out. So you're removing that potential nutrients going back in the dugout. So regularly harvesting of vegetation will improve your water quality. If your water quality is really bad, you may need, or one option is pumping out the water. So you're removing all that nutrient-rich water. And at that time, you can clean out your dugout. So remove that organic layer and you will have better water quality. So cleaning out or enlarging your dugout at that time, and then refilling the dugout in the spring, or if you have another water source close by, you can pump it over to it. So aeration. So I imagine most people with dugouts are familiar with aeration, but what aeration is the process of adding oxygen to the water. So generally under natural environmental conditions, the transfer of oxygen is insufficient for a healthy biological activity. So there is oxygen in the water, but unfortunately there's not enough, and particularly in hot summer days and in winter conditions. So ideally you should aerate your dugout year-round, 24/7. So when these dissolved oxygen levels drop, you get anaerobic conditions develop, and aeration will prevent dugout anoxia from occurring. So you'll have better water quality. When you have a low oxygen environment, certain elements come out of that sediment, and those are the elements or the nutrients that cyanobacteria and algae use. So if you can keep those in the sediment, you'll have better water quality. So the benefits of aeration: reduce the release of nutrients from the sediment. It improves color, smell, and taste of the water. Reduces algae and cyanobacteria blooms. So nutrients are one of the limiting factors for algae and cyanobacteria, along with temperature and sunlight. And it also reduces production of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide gas. So aeration will improve your water quality. Things to consider: First of all, you need to install your aeration system if you don't have one. You can use either electric, solar, or wind-powered sources, so all of those will work. If you do have electricity close, they're generally the most cost-effective, and they are very dependable. You'll definitely want to have a diffuser. So what a diffuser does is just produces more smaller bubbles, and you'll have increased oxygen levels. So there's two examples of diffusers on the right there. Make sure your aeration system is designed and work correctly. So that includes you'll have to go check it regularly and do maintenance on it when required. So again, look after your dugout, look at your dugout regularly. And aeration will improve your water quality. Treatment in situ. So in situ, as I mentioned earlier, is the treatment done in your dugout. So you're treating your whole dugout. And these are the 6 I'll talk about. So copper, chlorine, coagulation, herbicides, colorants, and what we know as magic bullets. So the first one is copper. So copper is used to control cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. So copper is highly toxic to living organisms at varying degrees. It will always disrupt biological life in a dugout system. So it's important not to overdose a dugout. You want to dose it on the low end, and make sure you treat the dugout before you get a large bloom. You'll want to make sure you do it early and not wait till you have a really bad situation occurring. You don't want to use the water for at least 14 days after. So if you are using the water for livestock, you want to have an alternative supply available. When you do treat a dugout with copper, with cyanobacteria, when you are treating for cyanobacteria with copper, the copper will cause the cyanobacteria cells to break down, and you will actually get likely more toxins in the water for that period. So that's the issue you may have. The copper treatment, you should use a chelated copper, and the reason you do that is it stays in suspension longer, so it's more effective. Often people will use copper sulfate, but the problem with copper sulfate is it's not approved for use in water. It's generally a veterinarian supply as far as I'm aware. And what you should be using is a copper product that's licensed by the Pest Management Regulatory Agency of Health Canada. And there are 4 that are available for that: Cutrin Plus, Algae, Boss, Polydex, and Think Purity. So all 4 of those are available. For a typical size dugout for 500,000 gallons, a 4-liter pail like the one on the right there is usually enough. That's kind of your standard dosage for that. So that should be good for a standard dugout. So those are available. Certain hardwares can carry them, or like specialty places that have dugout supplies. The next one is chlorine. I put this one in there because you definitely should not add chlorine to a dugout. It is a very dangerous thing to do. What's the problem with chlorine is it reacts with organics in the water, producing carcinogenic trihalomethanes. So a dugout contains organic material in the raw water, so you definitely don't want to add that to any raw water. Another issue with chlorine, it's a non-selective, it kills everything in the dugout. And when you kill everything in the dugout, you will eventually get algae blooms back, but they will be worse than before because you've killed the top predators that feed on the algae. So don't add chlorine to raw water like that. Next thing is treatment, so coagulation. Coagulation is you use chlorine aluminum sulfate or ferric chloride, ferric sulfate, or hydrated lime can be used. It's basically adding those chemicals to the water, and then it causes sediment or algae. Any large or small particle in the dugout will flock together, or in the water will flock together and be attracted to each other, and they will become heavy and sink to the bottom of the dugout. So they are an effective treatment, but you have to analyze the water prior to doing that. You have to check the alkalinity, and you should do a jar test, which is basically doing a little experiment with the water to see how much you should add. So you don't want to overdo it, or you can change the pH level in the water. It is very labor intense. Coagulation using aluminum sulfate is highly effective at removing suspended particles. It's often recommended, if you can, just treat the amount of water that you're actually going to use. So one option there is to construct a treatment cell on the side of your dugout. And what a treatment cell is just a smaller dugout that's lined usually with some impermeable material like a tarp or something like that. And then you only treat the water for a short period, say 3 to 6 months. So the advantage there is you're not spending as much money to treat the dugout, you're just treating the actual water that you're going to use. Next is liming with calcium hydroxide. So that is commonly done in the piece. You've probably seen that a lot, so it can be quite effective. Treatment herbicide. So you can use herbicide on your dugout. There is one that you can use. The commercial brand is called Reward, and that contains diquat. It's the only one registered for in water, and it's because diquat can go down through the water and attach to the plant and the roots. So that's how it works. And it is effective on submerged or emerged or floating aquatic plants. It's not effective on most types of algae, and it's not effective on cyanobacteria. So it's only effective on basically vegetation. The problem with herbicide is that you are killing those weeds, but those weeds will die and fall back to the bottom of the dugout, and then they will recycle the nutrients again. And as I mentioned, those nutrients are what feed the algae. So by getting rid of the weeds, you may actually increase your cyanobacteria. You don't want to use the water for 7 days after treatment. Next is pond dyes for treatment. So some people add what is known as pond dyes. And what they are is basically just they block the UV light. It prevents the light from going very deep in the water, and it inhibits the aquatic plant growth. So they do work. You have to retreat regularly, usually once a year if you have water going into your dugout. And there are a number of different varieties or different brands out there. Aquashade, Wavex, there's a number of them. They are not approved for human consumption though. And other products, so I talked about magic bullets. So there's a lot of other projects advertised that can clean up your water. You'll see those out there in the hardware store and the farm store. The problem is that they have a questionable track record. So they don't have a lot of research done on them. And generally any research is not up to research standards. So it is, manufacturers claim their product will clean up a dugout, but it's basically anecdotal evidence, buyer beware. So yes, you may put it in your dugout and your dugout may get better, but does it really, like, it may have got better anyway? Like, there's no research to show that it's because of that. It could be just a change in the weather or the time of the year or a number of different factors. So just beware, some of those are expensive and may not work as advertised. So in summary, you definitely want to limit what nutrients go into your dugout. So watch if it is any manure around, keep that out. You want to aerate your dugout to improve your water quality. If possible, harvest the nutrients, so get that vegetative matter out of the dugout. Make sure you apply caution with that, working around water. You want to treat with the appropriate products. So if you have weeds, you want to use a herbicide. If you have cyanobacteria, you want to use a copper product. And finally, if it gets really bad, you may want to consider pumping out your dugout or cleaning out your dugout to get rid of that organic layer. Any questions on that? Will grass carp control duckweed? Yes, I believe they would eat duckweed. They eat most vegetation. I don't know if grass carp are still available, like they were available for a while. I don't know the status on that, if they are or not still available. But I have seen dugouts where they've eaten almost, there was one or two types of weeds where they didn't really like those, but I'm pretty sure they would go after duckweed. But actually, if you have duckweed in your dugout, I don't recommend people spraying it out, because it can be good if you can get rid of that, like pull it off a certain amount. You don't have to get it all out, but if you get part of it out, you are controlling nutrients. So I wouldn't stress too much about duckweed. And sometimes if you have a lot of duckweed, it will lessen the cyanobacteria, because if it covers the dugout, the light can't get down there and you won't have cyanobacteria issues. So duckweed is actually kind of not too bad to have in a dugout. Okay, I'll go on to my last one here. Okay, I'm just going to talk, I still got a little bit of time here. I'm trying not to take too long, about the Canada Agriculture Partnership Program, or CAP, and particular the water program. And what the program is it supports the enhancement of agricultural water management for the continued growth and long-term success of the agricultural industry. There are two streams under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership Water Program, the first being on-farm water irrigation projects, and the second being on-farm water supply projects. So the on-farm water supply projects are what I deal with. So if you have any questions about that, you can just talk to me or email me regarding that. So there are two categories of projects within the on-farm water program. The first is standard incentive projects, and this include such things as wells, dugouts, spring development, cisterns, and unshared pipelines. The next one is special incentives, and these are projects that help the long-term viability of the water supplies. And this is stuff like well decommissioning, well pit conversions, and wetland assessments. So standard incentive projects, so things such as dugouts and wells, are eligible expenses where costs shared at 25% grant and 75% applicant. So that means if you are paid on the project, you get 25% back. Special incentives are a 50% grant and 50% applicant up to various maximums. So water source development, the maximum you can receive over the 5-year program, 2018 to 2023, is $5,000. So once you maxed out at $5,000, that's the most you can get out of that part of the program. And funding is limited, so it is a first come, first served program. So if you do a project, I recommend getting your application in as soon as possible. So I'm going to talk about dugouts here tonight because I don't have time to go through the other aspects of the program. But basically with dugouts, if you are interested in constructing a dugout, you must speak to an Alberta Agriculture and Forestry water specialist prior to the construction of the dugout. And we need this done to confirm that the proposed dugout meets the legislative and program requirements. So you basically need to contact a water specialist like myself, and we will look at the location of the dugout, the size of the dugout, and then once we review that and everything's good, we'll send you out an approval letter along with an as constructed sheet, and you can proceed with your project. We'll look at different things like the size of it. If it's too big, then we'll require that you go through that approval process with Alberta Environment and Parks. If it looks like it's in a wetland, again, we'll refer you over to Alberta Environment and Parks. Most other projects other than dugouts do not require prior approval in this program. The reason we have the dugout prior approval is just that, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that it is a legal project and that it meets the program requirements. So if you are interested in constructing a new dugout, some of the things that will be required are it has to be a minimum of 440,000 imperial gallons or 2,000 cubic meters. Dugouts must be a minimum of 13 feet deep. The side and end slopes must be no steeper than 1.5 to 1. And the spoil piles must be moved at least 15 feet back. We do pay on expansion of existing dugouts. They have to be expanded by a minimum of 200,000 imperial gallons or 25% of an existing dugout capacity, whichever is greater. And they must meet the volume, depth, side slope spoils as the existing new dugouts. For the program, we require that dugouts be protected. So that means we want to ensure that livestock are not directly accessing a dugout. So examples of this can be an off-source watering system, fencing to prevent direct access by livestock, or some combination of fencing with an off-source watering system. So when we're reviewing your dugout, we will be asking you questions about how, if it is a livestock dugout, how are the livestock going to access the water? So we'll review that and decide on what is agreed on. There is further information there at the CAP water program, and you can look at that if you want. If you want, I can go over briefly if I have time here, could I go over briefly the website?
Yeah, we have time.
Okay. So yeah, just do a Google search, just go CAP water and it should pop up for you, and that's the home page. And so if you're doing a project that doesn't need prior approval, basically you will do the project. Before you do the project, you should look at the funding, and there's a funding sheet there. Oops, that's not funding list. There we go, funding list. It has all the different things that we fund, so you can look through there, and there's different criteria. Probably the easiest thing is to scroll down to the bottom of the page, and it has all different fact sheets for different projects. So if you want to do a cistern or a dugout or unshared pipeline, there's all these different fact sheets you can look at and review. And so it just helps clarify the requirements that will be required. So like we'll do a simple one like wells. Let's open that up. And it just talks about project specific requirements. So it has to be a licensed water well driller. The casing has to extend 18 inches from the ground. You must have a well tag, must not be located in a pump house. And if it is a pasture well, it can't drain back from the trough back into the well. And a little bit of information about how you fill out your application as far as after you do the project. So basically what you do is you do the project, you pay for the project, and then you submit an application. So I'll just go back to the application here. I'm probably confusing everyone here, but the application form is here. So after you've done your project, you've paid for your project, and you're sure that everything is complete as outlined in the fact sheet and the funding list, you can go to this application form and just fill out the appropriate information required. So on the first page is just kind of the information about your farm and yourself. Page 2 is for irrigation projects, so you wouldn't be filling that one out. Page 3 is if it's a dugout or a well, you would just fill in the appropriate area, and etc. So I won't go through all that, but if you do have questions on that, you can always contact me or just go to the website. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of information there. Okay, well, I guess that's my 3 presentations. Does anyone have any questions or? Feel free to contact me. Did I have my email on the end here? Let's see here. Just one sec here. There's my email and phone number there for anyone that needs it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for presenting for us tonight, Dan. We really appreciate it. And
you're welcome.
Anyone watching who might want to revisit this, this has been recorded and we will be making it available to watch again eventually.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking your time to listen tonight, and thanks for organizing this for us.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.